I would just begin with taking your initial reactions to the budget. We will start with the finance expert, Ms. Saundar Rajan. Ma'am, your views, the initial reactions that you have on the budget.
I think as you know, this is the budget before the next election, yeah, the full budget before the next election, yeah, and we need to, in this country, always keep that in mind. I think it's been sensible in the sense I don't think there have been too many very big announcements, but I, for one, is someone who's very happy with that because I think we as a country tend to make a lot of hoo-ha about the budget, which shouldn't be the case. It's about accounts of the country, what's happening, and reform should happen through the year as and when required, and not just during the budget event. But I think the priorities have been set very clear, keeping in mind what is required. I think the focus on agriculture and a very different focus on agriculture. So this time you're not going after the inputs, so to speak, but it's about modernizing, it's about digitization. I think I liked that. And I also believe that in lieu of a impending recession fear that is going around globally, and somewhere anticipating the fallout of that on India, they've also been very sensible in terms of trying to make sure that consumption stays high by putting money into the hand of the consumer, of the individual or the citizen. So I cannot call it a fiscal stimulus because obviously we're not there, but it's making sure that spending stays up, effective demand will be there, in lieu of the fact that maybe a recession is going to happen. And if it does, and when it does, there will obviously be some kind of contagion effect on India, but to kind of mitigate that. So to that extent, I think it's kind of laying the foundation and kind of setting the path and saying we're okay and we'll be prepared. So it's also a prescient in certain ways in saying that I know what may happen, so I'm kind of already prepared, I'm cognizant, and we're doing what we need to make sure that things aren't that bad and things go by easily.
Gagan sir, over to you. Just to add on, along with your initial reaction, ma'am also said that we'll have to keep in mind that this is the full budget before the next election. Would you characterize that also in the same manner? Because the government seems to be very careful in saying that this is not an election year budget. It should not be looked at as an election year budget. Secondly, we are also looking at a lot more of involved discussions on the budget. Instead of looking at it merely as a statement of account, would you then also look at it from the point of view that there has to be a greater involvement and engagement of the citizen? At least, we'll hope that it will put the government on its toes and have a more responsibility and responsive budget.
Thanks. In my view, the budget, Prime Minister and Finance Minister time and again indicated that this budget is going to be more like a policy document. And the way it has been structured and the way certain policies have been laid down, it appears to me that it's more of a policy document. And I say it from just a couple of points I'll just mention. In 2014, we had 21st June declared as International Day of Yoga. This year, UN has recognized as Year of Millet. Now look at the consumption pattern being changed. The other day I was reading in the newspaper that ITC and even Tata Group, that Tata Consumer and some other FMCG companies are already evaluating products based on millets. In fact, there's a company which is considering a Bajra beer. So look at the way consumption is being changed. We have seen the crisis in several countries with the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. The food supply to various European countries has been adversely affected. If you look at it from that point of view also, it's a good amount of food security which is built into. So it's just not the financial document. It's a policy document whereby various habits are being changed. and globally we would be in a far better position. Like yoga is a soft power. Now everyone recognizes yoga with India, and it has done immense work in terms of changing the perception about the Indian passport. Similarly, if you look at the other efforts and the way things are evolving in a diplomatic world, you have seen where we have reached. So I don't see budget as a financial document, but yes, it is a document which changes several contours of the society. And law has always been used to, for want of better word, manipulate the habits. The way tax exemptions are given or tax exemptions are withdrawn, it compels you to change your consumption habit, whereby you end up changing your behavior also.
That brings me to you, Sharanya. Your initial reactions, as well as just to add on to what Gagan sir had said, that budget is now looking more and more like a policy document rather than simply a statement of the objectives and how finances are going to be utilized for those objectives. He has also said that it is now being envisioned as a document to push social change. Do you agree with that line of our approach, or do you think that budget should stick only to the finances and policy should be more debated and proper paper should be presented in the parliament for further discussion?
So thank you, Anand. I think very interesting question. There is no right or wrong in this, I feel. Let us look at what really the budget has been over the years. We've had stellar budgets. We've had very, very booed out budgets in the past. I'm not talking about this government, but even the previous governments that have laid out the budget. As Nirupama said correctly, the budget is an account statement, right? Now, having said that, an account statement, just because it's an account statement, doesn't mean it cannot have the power to shape policy. We used to have 5-year plans in the past. I think now the 5-year plans that we used to have, which we've all studied growing up, which was a very interesting concept initially. Instead of having that now, every year we are trying to see what we can glean from the budget, right? Budget does play a role in shaping policy. It does. But what kind of a budget shapes policy is also important to see. It is one thing to say that we want, this is the outlay. So where do you see, from which part of the budget are you going to see, figure out which sectors are going to get impacted this year, right? You see their outlays, you see where the maximum outlays being made. You see how many times a particular sector is mentioned, right? Budgets have also been in the past indications of impetus if it is to manufacture. For example, last year's budget. Frankly, I was very, very happy with last year's budget because the need of the hour is employment. The need of the hour, I'm not going to say make in India, because make in India really should mean from scratch made in India. Or you should have a technical advancement or substantial value addition in India. According to me, that is true make in India. Last year's budget, I felt, which came after the PLI scheme and which came and it tried to boost manufacturing capital goods, manufacturing electronics, etc. It was a very interesting budget because you could see parallel, simultaneous changes in customs exemptions, simultaneous overlays in the financial documents made to specific industrial parks. I don't see that this year, right? It could mean one of two things. It could mean that they're going to continue the policy of last year, that what was envisaged last year is still work in progress, and so we don't need to disturb that, right? That is one way of looking at it, and that is the way I intend to look at it. But having said that, this year budget has had some interesting, so for example, agriculture, green energy. We're also looking at G20 coming. So I feel there is a lot in this budget. It is also a budget which clearly says that we are looking at stability and financial discipline. That is really the need of the hour. And as both of them have said, um, in today's global economy, where there is war on one side, there is impending recession in the Western world, who are really recipients of our exports, right? We have to be very, very wary. And I think this budget, in that sense, is a very sensible budget.
Nirupama ma'am, I want to know your views on two questions now. All right. You mentioned about there being no direct fiscal stimulus, but the consumption pattern being shepherded in a manner to spur demand. Also, Sharanya has also touched upon fiscal discipline. Now, I want to know, are you comfortable with the deficit targets projected in the budget? Do you think the government has some kind of a plan to make up for the shortfall, given that the national monetization pipeline, the talk about that is subdued right now? It is not really being highlighted. Keeping that in mind, that is one question, ma'am. And the second question also is that she has also touched upon certain critical sectors, like the agriculture sector or sustainable development and green growth sector. Where really do we see that going? And in terms of the financial and economics, are the projects viable? Will we see measurable yields and results which will contribute to the growth?
Thanks, Anand. So those are three questions, so I'll start one by one. So let's start with the deficit targets. So we need to remember that we've emerged out of, 3 years, of very difficult years economically and from even a policy making point of view. It was as difficult for the government, I think, as it was for the average individual. And so therefore it's no surprise that the fiscal deficit was on the increase, and after a lot of, I think, containment, it obviously went very high because of a lot of money that was being offered in terms of relief packages, etc. So fiscal deficit, quite frankly, I think very reasonable targets, and I think a very reasonable way of trying to kind of come back into the fold of the usual acceptable number is 3%, not for any other. I mean, there's no, if you talk to most economists, they'd be like, there's no proper reason to it, but it's just a very kosher number to say that fiscal deficit at 3%, everybody is happy about it. But let's not challenge the why and how, but let's take that. But from, I think, currently the 6.9%, 6.1% that they want to come down to 5.9% in terms of fiscal deficit, I think it's reasonable. But I do have a problem with the revenue deficit targets. And I think I believe it's very unreasonable. I think it's a big challenge because if you look at your expenditure figures, you will see last year, the targeted revenue deficit was, I think, 3.8%. And it went up to 4.1% because if you look at the subsidy, just the three big subsidy bills, they were more than double what was budgeted expenditure. So if you look at budgeted, so you have, as most people know, when you see budget documents, you have budgeted estimates, you have revised estimates, and then eventually you will get the actual figures. So budgeted estimates is what at the beginning of the year one anticipates to spend. Revised is what you arrive at during a budget time with the last 3 months spending. So usually it's either less or more. They tell you whether they're on track. If they need more money, they will say we need more money, or if there is underspending, you will see that there is underspending. So currently, if you look at current year, if you'll see that the subsidy bill has gone up quite a bit, incredible amount. So which has led to your revenue deficit moving from its 3.8% budgeted estimates to about 4.1%. And the target for next year is 2.9%. It's a significant drop. And if you look at expenditure figures, so the capital expenditure, it's great, they've set it at 10 lakhs. And that leads us to your second and third question. But if you look at revenue side, where they're planning to cut, it's largely only on the subsidy bill. So PM Kisan allocation has come down. But even the rest of the other large heads in terms of your subsidies, they're hoping to spend less. I don't know how feasible that is going to be, especially because we still don't know what the state of economy is and whether they are really prepared to cut subsidy by such a large amount. So for that reason, revenue budget, revenue deficit targets is slightly problematic. And if I were to place a bet on it, I'm going to say they may not really meet their targets. Is that okay? It's okay. I don't think it's a problem per se, but you've set a target, and we'll see where that comes from. That's not to say that if they meet it, great. I'm skeptical, but if they don't meet it, is it problematic? Not really, is also my next point. So it's okay. It's just I'm commenting on a target that they've set. The focus on agriculture, which leads me to the next point that you were saying. The focus on agriculture, I think, is very important, and I think Mr. Kumar made a great point about, how you're aligning yourself not just to what is required of the country in the next couple of years, but also to what is happening around the globe. Millets is being pushed from a nutrition security point of view, from a food security point of view, and it's very good to see that the government doing this. But what I found even more interesting is about 2 or 3 days before the budget was announced, the Parliament canteen underwent an overhaul where they changed the menu to put in a lot more items which were millet focused. Now that is leading also by example, if you ask me. So when you do that and then you focus a budget on millets, you can see that they have also espoused the same values that they hope the citizens do, and they're leading by example. The interesting thing, the agriculture accelerator, as I said, one of the things I liked about the focus on agriculture this time is the fact that they've gone away from your traditional allocations and talking generally about just farmer welfare and all of that, and all of that's important, but you're actually looking at the enablers this time, and you're saying digitalization is important, bringing in technology. And when we're saying technology, it's not the same as mechanization. You're saying using technology. How can we use technology today to make sure that it leads to a better income and better decision making for the farmer? So the accelerator fund to encourage startups is great. But there's no allocation in the budget for the accelerator fund. My guess is it will probably come out of the agriculture infrastructure fund, which was announced last time. The agriculture infrastructure fund was largely put in place. There's a 500 crore allocation for that. There is no explicit allocation for the accelerator fund, but my guess is it will probably come out of that. That's the second, but I don't know. And maybe a little more information around this will be good to look at. The third, in terms of what you were saying, fiscal stimulus, etc. So typically when there is a recession looming at large, there are two things that one does. Go back to your 2007-8 global recession. What did most countries do? They had to make sure that the citizen had money in their hand. That's your fiscal stimulus. And that also spending is created, or spending is given a boost through government spending. So the capital expenditure is great. 10 lakh crore is huge. But also remember, with capital expenditure, and probably rightly so that they're investing it this year, there is a lag period in terms of getting returns on it, typical of any capital expenditure. So to that end, I think it's very sensible that they're making it this year, because you will probably reap the benefits of it 1 or 2 years down the line, when maybe if the recession does arrive, you will be in a full-blown state at that point rather than immediately. So to that extent, I think very sensible. And I'm not calling it a fiscal stimulus because it is not one, but it is obviously keeping in mind what is happening and making provisions slowly, steadily, and preparing ourselves for global repercussions of what may happen. Thank you.
Is it an apprehension that recession may happen, or are you giving a prediction that there is going to be a recession in the coming few years?
No, I'm not predicting. See, globally speaking, I think pretty much everyone's expecting it. I think the war is one reason. I think generally the way everything is growing, there's been a slowdown globally. We seem to be doing well, touch wood, and very good for us. But we need to remember that in today's day and age, India's integration with the global economy is a lot more than what it was 10, 15 years back. So therefore, today, contagion effect and the fallout will be felt a lot stronger than what we did at one point. So whether there is or not, like even with the war, we obviously had, when US and China had their war, economic war, so to speak, we had to face some problems there. So you will always have that fallout. So globally, I think, let's not get into recession or no recession, but there is of course going to be a slowdown. There already is.
2014 government came in power, NDA government, and we had this Jan Dhan account scheme. It looks very innocuous act, but then in 2015 came the black money voluntary disclosure scheme, which again, if you see in isolation, would not make sense. 2016 we had demonetization. So if whosoever couldn't open account, couldn't disclose the black money, had to face the burn. 2017 we had GST in place. So it was formalization of economy. So nothing is happening randomly. There's a thought process behind it. And if you look at this budget also, the way things are being done, and if you pay a little more attention to the fine prints, you'll see that the thought process is being changed for youngsters, especially because I guess what we have 66% of population below 35 years of age, and that's the population which drives consumption, and that's the population which has aspiration. Now, when you come up with a cruise bike ad, obviously, when I look at it, certain aspiration would or consumption would be there. But I need to have some means to buy that machine. Now, if I will not get, due to my skill set, a decent job, the possibility is that I'll do something hanky-panky or I'll become a criminal. So therefore, the idea is that if you keep focusing on job creation, that may not be a long-term solution. So ultimately, the idea is to change the society where they have to become an entrepreneur. And India has been historically an entrepreneur nation. I'll give you an example. It may be a very poor example, but recently I came across a situation where a sweeper was collecting 100 rupees a month from a rediwala. Now, 100 rupees a month means 30 days, 30,000 or 3,000. 3,000 rupees a month, and there were 10 redis on that road. So 30,000. For what was he collecting? Because if he would not clean that stretch, the customers would not go to that rediwala. So free में बैठे बैठे 30,000 रुपए महीने का जुगाड़ कर लिया उसने. So that's the kind of entrepreneurship mindset we have. Now, the other aspect is that there is an MSME Act. MSME Act requires that you have to make payment within 45 days, failing which there is a protection given to the MSME that they can go into arbitration. But in my experience, no MSME dare to go and sue a big corporate for non-payment within 45 days. If I were to start a business, the biggest challenge for me is cash flow. This budget, there's a very one subtle amendment in section 43B of the Income Tax Act, which essentially says that if you do not make payment to an MSME, then the expense will not be allowed as deduction. Meaning thereby that if I am buying any goods or services from MSME, I have to pay them before the end of the financial year by all means. That would essentially take care of my cash flow as a young entrepreneur. Now, there's another point that when we talk about whether the budget is inclusive or not, President had this mention in one of the conferences where Chief Justice was also sitting. She said that if we are really growing, why do we need more jails? And one of the biggest challenge in jails is that there are huge number of under trials who can't even afford to pay their bail money. This budget, they have announced a fund to pay for their bail money. So the point is that if you look at the MSME business, or you look at under trial who is languishing in jail for many years, look at the spectrum. And also there are lot number of amendments which were focused on anti-evasion. I'll not get much into it because that may become too technical. So it's not random. So the point you raised is that everything follows a thought process and it is gradually leading towards that objective.
So to follow up with what you spoke about MSMEs particularly, are there any suggestions that you would give in the MSME Act as reforms which would further strengthen the objective and the processes envisaged in MSME? Keeping particularly in mind that MSME Samadhan is not really as big a success as we hoped it would be.
Yes, it won't be. And in fact, I have been writing letters since 2010 to bring this 43B amendment. So I was very happy to see that ultimately after 13 years this amendment has happened. So yes, MSME, I think this is the best solution one could achieve in the given legal framework. Because you see, getting into litigation doesn't yield anything. And we are litigators and we see how it happens. It's a good livelihood for us, but it doesn't give benefit if you do not have the wherewithal to stay strong up to the higher court.
Right, this is an open question for anybody who wants to take. Tied closely to food security is also the health and nutrition aspect. There are year after year studies and reports coming in where India is ranked very low on the nutritional spectrum, and there are also medical studies which suggest that it has a direct impact on the cognitive skills of the younger generation. Given that more than half the population is the youngsters, and we want to give an entrepreneurial push to them, thought of innovation has to be there. Without the basic brain functions being at an optimal level, how would we then achieve it? What should be the focus on health and nutrition? See, this has been a pet question of mine for a few years now.
Let me. I'm not a health or a nutrition expert, but as a macroeconomist, you need to learn a little bit about everything. So I'll tell you, I'll tackle this from a slightly different perspective. I think, look at it from the way I would want to look at it is from a distribution point of view, which means we have PDS for a reason. You want food security, which means you want to make sure that every person has access to good food. And what is therefore good food? We have to first re-examine our own definition of what is good food. We did, and part of Tele India Foundation, a very interesting study on what are known as meal cards. For the person here to understand, like your Sodexo vouchers. So meal cards are prepaid instruments which has a certain amount. Now in India, we're using the, it's more of a tax benefit kind of thing. However, if you take example of Brazil or many of the other countries, they've used meal cards as a way of delivering great nutrition. So instead of going into, let's say, a PDS system, they've converted PDS into a prepaid instrument. So where they give you a loaded prepaid instrument card and they say, this is the amount of money I'm giving you. Now go buy nutritious food, what you think is fit at any point. So we need to also re-examine our own way of saying, so, under PDS, I'm making sure that there is rice available for you, great, I'm making sure there is this available. But are we making sure that we're giving them nutritional food? And remember that in a country like India, what is considered nutritional food varies literally from village to village. Because our cuisines are different. We grow up eating different things. We grow up being told what is okay, what is not. I'm a vegetarian, so my view of what is nutritious can be very different from somebody who eats meat. Or somebody who eats only fish. So it is different. So the question therefore also is that can we standardize what we're offering under PDS and say this is what everyone gets because this is my idea of what is a nutritional meal? Or can we think differently? You have the millet focus coming, and I think like they're trying to augment our own perception of what is good food, I think the same has to be inward for the government in terms of revamping PDS. And to see how can we use the PDS more effectively to not just ensure that there is access to food, but there is access to nutritious food. And does it have to be in the form of only giving food? Because that's what PDS does. The subsidy is in the form of food subsidy. Or can we look at other ways of doing it? I'm not always a great fan of direct cash transfers and saying do what you want. But Today with technology, you have ways in which you can make sure that cash transfers also are effective and are being used for the end purpose that you want them to be used for. So maybe we need to rethink how we are dispensing with it and to rethink what the subsidy is supposed to achieve, and whether the subsidy can also, the food subsidy can also include nutrition as part of its objective, which I don't think today is, and hopefully I think the government is trying to change that, and it will take a while maybe, but hopefully that will happen soon enough. And when that shift happens and we re-examine how we are dispensing that subsidy, hopefully the nutritional security, because that's a word that's coming up now, even the government started using nutritional security rather than food security, which shows the shift in thinking, and I think that will follow suit soon enough.
So, yeah, thank you. I think just adding or taking that thought forward, if we had to look at what form of government are we in, right? Indian government has not been a complete hands-off government like what we see in the Western world in terms of, say, how the US is very hands-off, and then each state makes its own law and things like that. And they're very minimal interventionist governments in that sense. India is somewhere in the middle. We are somewhere in the middle. We like to have some social initiatives, be it the Manrega scheme, be it Aadhaar, etc. So there are social initiatives, but we always are trying to balance between how much we should intervene in a personal capacity with people, with individuals, versus where should we stand back as a government. Having said that, I think two things or three things off the top of my head, which I think India could focus on, the government could focus on, is increase spending on R&D, right? R&D in microbiology, R&D in nutritional sciences is the need of the hour. So how much is, say, IARI, CSIR getting funding for research on developing new varieties? So I know that, earlier there was vitamin A to be introduced in mustard. That was one of the projects there was a research in that, right? Because it was found that there is severe vitamin A deficiency in certain regions. So where they are going to have more mustard oil, to increase vitamin A availability in that oil, you're going to reduce certain deficiencies. So it has to be very holistic, okay? One is, how are you going to identify sectors? It cannot be, you can't do this in one stroke. You have to say stage-wise, what are the main deficiencies across the region? Because she's very right. In different parts of the country, you'll have different deficiencies. You'll have different concept of food, concept of nutrition, and concept of access to nutritive food. So number one, region-wise, are you picking out the top 3 nutritional deficits? And we're talking about nutrition at vitamin mineral level. I'm not talking about calorie deficit. We talk about nutrition. So identify that, and then probably increase spending in those fields. Second, I know that the Anganwadi system works well. I've worked in some matters where we've dealt with Anganwadi systems, and I know that it's otherwise a system that works well. We work with, one of our clients does CSR initiatives, and they have come back and said, so encephalitis, different diseases. So how the on-the-ground Anganwadi system is fairly robust. So then the second can be, because there at that level, if you're going to increase awareness, that's not going to make a difference. In urban area, you increase awareness because you are going to depend on the intellect and the awareness and alertness of the educated urbaners to be able to pick and make that choice of picking a nutritive option. Whereas at rural level, you can take that initiative. As a government, you can put these initiatives at the Anganwadi level, midday meal schemes, etc., that we are going to make a rule that this is the nutritive content that has to be delivered. So I think these 2-3 things, if we can start looking at in that aspect.
Well, we may not be the right person to speak on health and nutrition, because for us round is also a shape. So, but coming to the point that how crucial nutrition or the nutrient diet is important. I'll give you an example. I'm part of Swadeshi Shod Sansthan, and there was a research done and the paper was published. one of the point which was highlighted was that even the richest state in India, Gujarat, the physical structure of a person may not be fit enough to work for 8 to 10 hours. So if in your office, if someone takes a sutta break, it's not that he's a kamchor, he's tired actually. So that's the importance of nutrition. So one, that. Secondly, if you look at the other thing, the health aspect, I'm part of Rotary also, so we do few projects in Delhi, and in our studies we came across this aspect that more than 15% of deliveries are still happening at home in the NCR region, Delhi NCR region. You may not believe it, but there are clusters and slums and the rural area in and around Delhi where it is still happening. The other aspect is, if you would see the impact of reverse migration, one of the positive fallout of reverse migration was the awareness about menstrual hygiene and the packed products in the rural area, because it was not so prevalent there. But when people walked back to their hometowns, that's when the demand for these products also emerged. So it's a very crucial area, and I think the policy initiative in terms of changing the food habits, I think it's a step in that direction. So as I said in the beginning, that it may look random, but it's not random. There's a thought process behind it. It appears to be that there's a thought process behind it.
Well, this brings me to, from policy, I want to move to tax laws now, to Sharanya specifically. What are the key tax law or tax law amendments and takeaways that you have from this budget?
Right. I wish I could tell you there are lots. But this budget has been a fairly relaxed affair for many, at least indirect tax lawyers. Direct taxes, of course, there have been very interesting amendments. I think online gaming is an interesting amendment that we are seeing, so we'll come to that later. Tax law amendments, if you see, is more, I think, housekeeping that we have seen this year. Nothing extraordinary in that sense. Few sectors, I mean, in customs you can see certain exemptions being withdrawn, the gold sector, jewelry sector. Some impetus given in pharma and chemicals by reducing the import duties of certain inputs. So that's interesting. Again, going back to your first question of policy, so therefore it seems to be that there is an increased push for manufacture in the chemical and the pharma sector. Having said that, in terms of solar energy, I know again the push is for Make in India for solar panels. So they have withdrawn the exemptions from project imports for solar panels and things like that. So it's interesting to see. Again, there is no thread that we can sort of put together and say these ABCD sectors will definitely get impacted. But these are somewhat of the major changes that we see. Other things are more, as I said, online information, OIDAR service, right? They have made a subtle amendment in the definition, which is going to have a large-scale implication in how OIDAR services are going to be treated. And that's important because a lot of these OIDAR, which is online information directory access service, a lot of these are, today I know that there are investigations going on against international companies who have some base in India, customer base in India, etc. So it'll be interesting to see the impact on international companies which have a base in India because they've removed that minimal human intervention portion. So in terms of services sector, I feel e-commerce and online database is going to get impacted. And offline manufacturing, few sectors where they've given the impetus.
You did mention about online gaming, so I'll stay with you there for a moment. This budget has only touched upon tedious aspect of online gaming generally, but what are your thoughts as a lawyer on the regulatory framework for online gaming?
Wow, lots of thoughts. Lots of thoughts, but So let us just step back. Okay, so what is this whole controversy that everyone's reading about in online gaming? Let's just step back and look at that. In the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen an explosion in online games, right? And it's a mix of games. We're talking about poker, we're talking about lotteries, we're talking about fantasy games, right? At the outset, I have not played any of these games. So I'm actually not competent to comment, I think. But I can give you a very impartial view, therefore, of these games. What was happening really is that, and I think this whole COVID lockdown, the access to these games increased. You know, India has the largest penetration. I think this, yeah, check, yeah. This is, I think this equally does not work, but it's okay. So, India has the largest penetration when it comes to, oh, this started working. Largest penetration in terms of smartphones, right? And it is the largest penetration world over. What has that led to? That has led to access to online resources. So, over the last few years, you see that effects of this online gaming, which now regulators are seeking to regulate. And largely, it is the indirect tax and direct tax regulation in the online gaming sector. So, you have winnings, and then you have what is your, your table money or something that they call it. So you put in some money and then you have winnings. The investigation today that's happening in GST, I think Gamescraft is one of the biggest investigations that we are seeing. Sorry. So the investigation that we are seeing today in indirect tax is to understand how much of this is really coming as a game of chance. Because in GST, you can tax only if it's a game of chance. If it's a game of skill, you can call it an actionable claim and you need not pay GST. So today the question is how much of the earnings or which part of the amount you're putting in pool money, which part of it that's coming back to you can be treated in either your hands as a player or in the hands of the company as winnings, how much of it is the access fee, and how much of it can be attributed to it being a game of chance. This is when it comes to indirect tax. And a lot of clarity is needed. We know that the GST Council has been deliberating upon this. We've had some recommendations coming in. It's not really clear yet. Having said that, this year's budget amendments, as you rightly said, has touched upon the TDS aspect. It says 10,000 rupees in a financial year is, anything above that, you will have to deduct TDS. Again, the question is it, I think, yeah. Question again is, isn't it too small a threshold, right? In the entire year, if you're going to be making more than 10,000, and it's onerous on the company to now deduct TDS. So these are things that are going to now create some issues in the coming future. Winnings, earlier I think there was a doubt about winnings. Now they're saying only net winnings. So few changes have been made this year. Regulation, I think in the next few months we will get to see the rules getting formed. Rules have to define what is the game, because still that's a little bit unclear, because then there is a disparity between in the indirect tax regime and the direct tax regime. There's going to be a disparity. So those are some places there are big gaps, but their attempt is to sort of definitely regulate this. Unfortunately, regulation just doesn't mean tax regulation, but that's what seems to be happening. And it's more a race between, I feel, the direct tax and indirect tax authorities. Who is going to get to these winnings first? Who is going to tax them how much? I think that's where it is now. Next few months, we'll see some rules.
Sorry. Can I? No, yeah. No, I want to generally interject because literally 3 days back, Pele India Foundation's come out with a report called a regulatory framework for online gaming. So for those of you who would like to read it, please do go and access it. Dealing with exactly the question you asked. So tax is only one component. MeitY did recently come out with draft proposed amendments to the intermediary regulation, which is interesting because they're looking at online gaming platforms as intermediaries. And to comment on Sharanya's point from the tax angle, technically games of chance are not allowed in most state governments. So you can,
Yes, yes,
so from
yes,
that point of view,
absolutely.
So, and the regulations today have not, the draft, amendments have not really defined what a game of skill is versus what could be construed as game of chance. They've left it outside of their ambit, probably because it's not always very easy to define. You see, in India, if you look internationally, this distinction doesn't exist. You regulate it as a whole. But in India, we like complicating things for ourselves in certain manners. So we've chosen to define, or we've chosen to create a segregation between what is considered a game of chance versus game of skill, largely because of social taboo of gambling. Let's be honest, that's what it is. Because you don't want to legalize gambling. If we did, then everything would kind of fall under the same ambit, etc. I think with online gaming, the TDS bit is one way. For example, in the previous budget, they introduced taxes on crypto transactions. So again, so I think it's also a way of collecting data and collecting better data.
Yeah.
So taxes, today tax
TDS
information,
that,
yes, tax information becomes a great way of getting better information. And not from self-declaration and just returns, but also because when you get TDS, you will also get not just company figures, but you will also get to understand better on, yes, the patterns of playing. So even if you look at our regulatory framework that we've recommended, and the MeitY amendment, I think they've asked for an SRO, and a very well-structured SRO, a self-regulatory organization. But we're also asking for a gaming commission of sorts to be. That's one of our recommendation, because I believe an SRO, while extremely important, cannot be issuing licenses, and typically SROs don't have the right also to impose pecuniary fines or any kind of, money-related aspects. So for that to happen, you will need a regulator. And I think it's always better to kind of set up an intermediary between, a ministry being a regulator versus a proper statutory regulator. Also because I think for sunrise sectors, and this is a sector which will contribute, you need to have regulation which is nimble. Because these are new sectors, they will develop, innovation will happen, and you need regulation which is more nimble. And if you kind of do it through a statutory law, amendments through parliament can take longer, and you will see sector developing faster than the regulation can keep pace with. So typically so you can do it through maybe rules and guidelines from a regulator which are more amenable to change and easier to change. So I think from that point, we will see a lot of momentum in this area as far as online gaming is concerned.
Gagan sir, would you like to add anything to that?
So just one point, and the way I look at tax provisions is part of social engineering. So crypto government could not ban, and I have been very critical of crypto personally. Not that my son couldn't make great amount of money, but generally, because my belief is that it does not have any underlying asset. So first of all, to call it a currency, I think to my mind is a misnomer. Anyways, so the way crypto taxation was brought in, there was no deduction which was permissible. Even if you incurred some loss, that could not be set off. As against the taxation on online gaming, and as Nirupma ji mentioned, it's a sun-rising sector. So here the tax is on the net winning. So whether the losses would be carried forward or not, I don't think there's any clarity on that. But at least within the year, if there is any losses, I think that can be set off. But again, if you look at from social engineering sector, crypto is to be discouraged. Therefore, it's very harsh taxation on crypto. But online, it's more of a regulatory taxation.
Thank you all for joining us. I think this brings us to the close on this panel.